Welcome to In His Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters, produced by Marking Ministries. Each In His Grip message is designed to help turn your hearts toward Jesus and equip you to walk by faith. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary as he preaches the series, The Songs of Christmas.
You don't own those children. They belong to God as His heritage. They're on loan to you and to the rest of us who are part of the covenant community. Mary and Joseph knew that. And the first place they head after that child is 8 days old is into the church to expose that baby to what his lifestyle would be from that point on. They had a high view of the church. What's your view of the church? Why is it that in many churches our children can't wait to leave? Why is it that they almost can't wait until that magical day when they get their driver's license so they can say to their moms and dads, I don't want to do this anymore? How many of you, your children are not walking with God and it breaks your heart? Where are we failing? What are we missing? Is it just our culture? Is that all it is? Is it that our kids are being raised? I mean, I hear parents, I've used these excuses myself. Well, my kids are being raised in a different generation than I was. That's just my way of excusing my failure. Yeah, that's true. Our children are being raised in a different generation than we were. But the principles of Scripture are eternal. They don't change from culture to culture. They are eternal principles. Where are we failing? First place Mary and Joseph head is to the church. Now, you know, it's real easy as a parent. When your children book and they walk away from the church, it's real easy to blame the church. That alleviates your guilt. That takes the responsibility off you, and you find all the fault with the church. And certainly the church has to bear her share of the responsibility. But ultimately, that child doesn't belong either to you or to the church. That child belongs to God. We have certain responsibilities God requires of us. You know, I have a vision for our children. We've raised our 4 children. We're now involved in the process of instructing and teaching and helping our children to raise their children. I've told you this for years. Even when our children were babies, I used to tell you folks this. You will not know, and we will not know, whether or not we are successful parents until we see what kind of kids our kids raise. Then we'll know. Then we'll know whether or not what we taught them is getting through or got through. And so we're watching very closely to see how our children are raising their children. And I want to tell you, it's encouraging to see the values with which our children are raising their kids. And it always comes back to this: those babies do not belong to them. They belong to God. I have a desire. I have a vision for your children. I want your children to view the church a certain way. For example, I want our children to have a realistic view of body life behavior. I think one of the reasons kids leave the church is because they have an unrealistic view of how Christians are supposed to behave. You know, one of the things that we think about each other, Christians aren't supposed to fail. Our children are raised with that. I thought they were Christians. You've had non-Christian people say that to you, haven't you? When you failed them, haven't you had non-Christian people say something to the effect, I thought you were a Christian? Because the standard or the expectation of how we're supposed to behave is higher than what they perceive is normal. So we are expected to perform above and beyond. The problem is that same expectation makes its way into the church. We have that same view of each other. We're unrealistic about body life behavior. I want our kids to see us fail in-house. We raised our children with this philosophy. If you're going to fail, we want you to fail in front of us. We want you to fail forward. we used to teach them that. We want you to fail forward, not backward. But we always taught them, you're going to fail. There will be times that you fall. We want you to fall in front of us. We want you to fall in front of our eyes. We want to be able to see it and witness it. And the greatest heartbreaks we had in raising our children was when they failed outside of our presence, not in our presence. When we found out about it secondhand, that hurt us more. But we always taught them, fail forward. The problem is, when you come into the church, if there ought to be one place, there ought to be one place on the face of the earth your children are able to fail forward, it ought to be here. And they ought to be able to see your tolerance for other believers who are failing forward. I'm not always going to be pleasing to you. The leaders of this church aren't always going to do the right things. We aren't always going to be doing what you consider to be the right thing. We're not always going to meet your needs. We're not always going to be good churchmen. This is not always going to be a safe haven. Your children ought to be able to see that body life expectations should be realistic. This is a house full of sinners. My first expectation is that we teach our children a realistic expectation of body behavior. A second expectation that I have for your children is this. I think when they come to church, there ought to be expectant worship. I think children need an environment that's exciting. Now, I know we get into all kinds of debates about what's right and what's wrong and when it becomes entertainment and all these other things. But I got to tell you something. I've noticed the young people in our church are really learning how to worship. That's exciting to me. One of the things I like to do is I like to observe worship. I like to see people. That helps me worship when I see you worship. It is exciting to watch our young people worship. It is exciting to see that they are being brought in to the context of worship where they can exercise their gifts. You know, it's interesting to me, where do you find Jesus at the age of 12? Sitting at the feet of the great teachers of his day and debating with them the Bible. We don't have that anymore. We don't have expectant worship. Thirdly, I believe for your children, the church ought to be a place where legitimate questions can be asked and answered. You know, somehow or another, we communicate to our kids that Christians never question. Well, I'm going to stand up here right now as the senior pastor of this great church, and I'm going to tell you, I have questions. Some of them have never been answered. There are aspects of God's character and nature I neither understand, and the parts of it I do understand, some of it I don't agree with. Now, how's that for tooting your horn in God's face? I don't agree with it. And I'm working through those, and I'm struggling through those things to get to the point of agreement. But denying and resisting my questions is hypocrisy. It's not wrong to question. It is wrong when God reveals the answer, not to accept it. But it's not wrong to question. The church ought to be a place where kids can ask legitimate questions. You know, one of the things I told my wife the other night as we were getting ready for bed, I said, I really have a vision of a series of messages I want to preach. Might end up in a book somewhere someday. But I know it's going to be so much hard work that I don't want to promise you I'm going to do it. But it's a sermon series on Christian cliches. I think clicheism is deadly in the church. A cliche like, trust the Lord. What does that mean? Trust the Lord. Or, we know all things work together for good to those who love God. Or, God will explain it to you someday. And you can come up with your own cliches. And we hand them out, man, we hand them out like our ushers do donuts on Sunday morning. We hand them out just, they're as easy as buying a dozen donuts. We just hand them out left and right. And we're so cliched and so tuned into what the Sunday school answers are that we don't teach our people how to think. We don't use our minds. We don't use our brains. If the pastor uses a big word, we click it off. It's too hard. I need a smaller word that'll help me. Well, why don't you learn what the bigger word means? Why don't you stretch a little bit? Write it down. Go home and look it up and say, what's this mean? So that the next time it's used, I understand it. Jesus sat under the great teachers of his day at the age of 12. You say, well, he was Jesus. Well, you know, one of the things the Bible tells us about our Jesus is that he was sent to this earth and walked a certain way so that we could pattern our lives after him and walk in his steps. So you're not off the hook because he's Jesus. I have a fourth expectation for the church. That this place becomes a house of prayer and a place where the scriptures are studied, where doctrine is learned, and they're not afraid of it. I think your children need to learn what the word reformed means. You know, if something is reformed, that means that what it reformed was corrupted. That's why it needed reforming. You following me? If it's reformed, it's reforming something that previously was corrupt. So they not only need to know what the 5 points of the Reformed faith are, they need to know what those 5 points were addressing. And why it was corrupt. And how it applies to them. And what it says about God's grace. You say, I'll let the church teach them that. I'll let the church teach them that. Nowhere are you abrogated of that responsibility. We are to complement what you do, not replace what you do. We are to be a support base for you, an extension of your home, but never ever to replace the teaching that comes from the fathers and the mothers to their children. You need to teach them to pray. You need to teach them how to study the Word. Next, the church needs to be a place where the gifts are exercised. When are you going to step out of the woodwork? When are you going to step forward and say, God, I have gifts? You know what you communicate to your children when week in and week out you just sit there and take up space? That the church is a place where you sit and take up space. That wasn't really hard to think through, was it? If I'm going to sit there and raise my children for 18, 20 years, and they're going to see me sitting there every week, coming to church, paying my respects, going home, and doing nothing to drag my weight, to pull my weight, just do it, just come and play the role, sit in the pew, occupy the space, but never ever step forward and exercise my gifts. And you know, I'll go one step further. Some of us do step forward and exercise our gifts. And our children are watching. We step forward, we exercise our gifts, somebody in the church disappoints us, and we quit. And our kids sit there and they watch that. Like little sponges, they just take it all in, take it all in. If I don't get it my way, I quit. I quit. It's too hard. Too hard. What's it going to take to get you out of the woodwork? Do you know what lives in woodwork? Termites live in woodwork. And they eat away at the foundations. And the church disintegrates because of the termites. So are you calling me a termite? You got the shoe. You see if it fits. a place for gifts to be exercised. Next, I think the church needs to be a house of reverence. A house of reverence. I was glad when they said to me, let's go up to the house of the Lord. Now, I don't mean by house of reverence that we don't act like we're at home. I think the church also needs to be a place that's an extension of your home. I think it's a place where we can enjoy fellowship with one another. But there is something special about the church, isn't there? And our children need to be taught, you are going to the house of the Lord. There are times I don't feel like coming here. There are times where I don't feel like preaching. But there has never, ever, 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 ever been a time that I allowed that to stop me. And there has never, ever, ever been a time when I felt that way coming here that I wasn't blessed beyond measure when I left here. Because I think God honors those times when we say, Lord, I just don't feel like it. But I'm going to do it anyhow because I know it's right. You teaching your children that? Next, I think it needs to be a place for sober living. Say, what do you mean? I mean, in the church, there is a time to weep and there is a time to rejoice. And your children need to learn those seasons of change in the church. There are stages that churches go through, and your children need to grow through those stages. They need to have sobriety, sober thinking, where they sit down and they begin to reflect. Something's going on in my church that requires that I weep. Something's going on in my church that requires that I laugh. Churches go through seasons. Your children need to see that kind of stuff happening, and they need to rejoice with those who rejoice. They need to weep with those who weep. Let me give you a couple more and then I'm finished. We haven't even touched the song yet. We'll get to that next time. Your children need to see that this is a place that has a broad worldview, where we see the issues in the newspaper in the light of Scripture. That is so important. Because you know what's happening in the theological world today? And the theological world, by the way, is married to the elite media. The elite media and the liberal, theologically liberal Christian community have married each other. And here is the basic philosophy of that worldview. That worldview says we must separate the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. And what we do with the Bible is we say the Bible was written later, maybe 100 years after Jesus was on the earth, maybe 200 years, by scholars who placed into the Scriptures stories that fit their image of Jesus. And the liberals tell us what you need to do is filter out the facts, that is the Jesus of history, from what they call the Christ of faith. Now, the liberals have been doing that for years. The elite media has picked up on that, and they say, that's comfortable. We like that. That removes the miracles from the Bible. That takes the supernatural out. That allows many roads to heaven. That just makes Jesus an ordinary man. And so the religion that you see being reported by the elite media is usually focused on those liberal thinkers who separate the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. Your kids need to be able to pick that up. You ever watch the Discovery Channel? The Discovery Channel, I think it's the Discovery Channel, has Mysteries of the Bible. They usually have 5 or 6 scholars. 4 of them or 5 of them are liberal thinkers, and they always throw in the token conservative. And he's usually quoted maybe twice during the whole thing, but the rest of them all come around and they say, well, this is what really happened. The zealous Christians from the 2nd century reinvented the Gospel of Matthew. They brought in a a virgin birth. They brought in a physical resurrection. But we know those things never really happened. This is the Jesus of history who was certainly a good figure and needed to be followed, but he's different than the Christ of faith that they invented later on. Your kids need to watch stuff like that. You need to tape it. You need to stop the tape and say, what's wrong with that? Tell me what's wrong with what he just said. Sounds good. They even have music. There's music, background music. Sounds good. I'm sitting there and I'm saying, oh, you don't get it. You missed the point. Recently, one of them said, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have different accounts of what Jesus said as the 7 last words on the cross. Therefore, the conclusion was, he said none of those things. Since the Gospels aren't consistent in what he said on the cross, then he didn't say any of it. Now, what would you say to your kids? What would your answer be? What would good scholarship say? Well, I'm not going to give you the answer. You figure it out. You figure it out. But there's something wrong with it. We need to be able to read in the light of Scripture what the modern media is telling us. That's what it means to help your kids develop a worldview, how to view the world. What's wrong with some of the politics of the liberals who hold office? Why are these things smacking in the face of Scripture? How do your children respond to the abortion issue? What do your children say when they hear the media talking about the lovelessness of Christians when it comes to gay marriages? Why do you have an opposition to gay marriages? Are you a gay hater? Is that what you are? Are you a gay banger? Are you a hate monger? Is that why you're opposed to it? What position can you hold? And how can you justify it from Scripture? Your kids need to know the answers because they're going to go to school and they're going to be educated by people who have been raised in the churches that separate out the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. How are they going to respond? Next to last, your children need to see the church as a place where they can find role models. You got to be able to point around and say, this is a role model. This is a role model. I remember one night, Sunday night, late Sunday night, a man who doesn't go to this church anymore, but is kind of one of our honorary members. He's an elder in another PCA church down south. But he came out of this congregation. Every once in a while, he travels through town and he showed up at my door on a Sunday night. Just came to visit as he was passing through, and we sat there, we had some fellowship together. And then later a knock came not a knock, my kids don't knock anymore, but Chuck and Melanie came over. And they walked into the house and walked through the kitchen and into the living room where we were sitting, and they saw him sitting there. And I'll never forget, Melanie did not know he was there, but she made this comment. She said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you." She said, "I was just thinking about you the other day. I remember as a kid growing up in the church, I remember the way you used to teach us the Bible. And I even have some comments in my Bible of what an impact you made on my life." And we had just been talking about that together. We had just been talking about the need for role models. Years later, she still remembers this man as a role model. I think we need more of that. I'm tired of Michael Jordan being your kid's role model. I'm tired of Madonna being your daughter's role model. I'm tired of the rock musicians being your kids' role models. I'm tired of the actors and actresses. You ask those kids who played in the movie Ransom, and they'll tell you just like that. But you ask them who was William Tyndale, and they won't be able to tell you who he was. Ask them to name 3 of the Reformation characters, and they probably won't be able to tell you. But ask them who the star was, who took his clothes off in the last movie. They'll tell you. We need role models. Starting with you fathers. Starting with you dads. Your boys need role models. They need to be able to grow up and say, I want to be just like my dad. Now, if your kid says that, does it make you afraid? And then finally, I believe the church is a place where your children need to learn to network in lifelong relationships that have roots. I've been friends with some of you for over 20-some years. My kids grew up with some of your kids. Your children are now having babies. My children are having babies, and some of them grew up together. They watched you walk through the very same things that we walked through. They complained about the schools the same way your kids complained about the schools. They grew up with the heartbreaks the same way your kids grew up with the heartbreaks. What's interesting now is for me to see your children who grew up with my children taking on leadership roles in the church. Man, that just juices me up. I just get all pumped up when I see that your kids and my kids are stepping forward and saying, this no longer will be my church, this is my church. And I'm going to step forward and take leadership. That's exciting.
Thank you for listening. For the complete sermon, please visit markinc.org and click In His Grip. Join Dr. Chuck F. Betters in the sanctuary from Monday to Thursday on the In His Grip podcast.